I'm Andrew from the Dad.io podcast. Life supplies the inputs and we supply the outputs. Part of the GonnaGeek network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other fantastic and amazing geeky shows at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
Get ready for a change up and welcome to episode 167 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we debate making changes to your podcast.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we talk about some changes within the industry that you've probably heard about everywhere.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we take your feedback, including one listener who had a question about some confusion in a recent episode.
Lauren, start the show now. Just don't change the host of this show.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen Jondrew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 167 of Better Podcasting. We're here with another episode, and we like to kick this off with a How I Saved My Podcast story here on Better Podcasting. If you're not familiar with that, How I Saved My Podcast stories is all about how you have saved your show. And if you haven't saved your show, my good friend and co-host Stargate Pioneer is going to go and make one up.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to say thank you for introducing me. I know that was a little bit of change up from previous episodes, and I was just about to say, you know, a good way to save your podcast would be to introduce your co-host, but you actually did that, so we don't have to talk about that.
I did. I thought I would shake it up. You know, everybody's all about, oh, you got to save time at the beginning. You don't have time for formalities. So instead, we spent 3 times as much talking about it. Take that. You lose, we win. Continue.
You always win when it's on your own podcast. Look, we have this segment at the beginning of our show, How I Save My Podcast, and basically it's a community education event. If you have something that goes wrong with your podcast and you actually get it to save and publish the episode anyway, we want to hear about it. We do it. We know you do it. And we know everybody that has a podcast that's had to do it at one point in time. So we want to hear your story. It doesn't have to be a technical story. It could be with a guest, could be like with the interview, you had to edit it, whatever it is, we want to hear about it so you can get it to us through all the ways. Email podcast@betterpodcasting.com is the best. If you take a video and send it in to us, or if you take some audio, that would be great too. What we have this week, though, is we have a How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. Now, this is when we go out into the interwebs and we read something that piques our interest, which is categorically a How I Could Have Saved My Podcast story. This one comes from the podcasting subreddit by user Darling Deer. And Darling Deer, I'm going to say it's a she, and if it's a he, I'm sorry, but Darling Deer, it just sounds like a she. What do you think, Stephen?
I think that it's an actual animal. That's what that we're talking about here, a deer.
A deer, not a Canadian moose, but a deer.
It's a deer podcaster. That's a deer. I'm like 99% sure that that's the case.
Okay, so if it's actually a woman, I'm not going to actually insult her by calling her a deer.
Well, it's a doe. Wait, it's continue.
Okay. Anyway, it was posted by Darling Deer, and Darling Deer said, quote, "I was podcasting for a while, and it was fun. But life has gotten too busy to continue. No sense paying the monthly Libsyn fee. Is there some way to keep the podcasts available online without that, or do they disappear once I close the account? I don't understand this aspect of it that well." There was a reply from user Pulpurry who said, "You can drop down to the cheapest plan, like $5 a month. We'll keep it going." Yes, that's the way to save your podcast. You drop down to the $5 plan, which Libsyn has, and I have yet to find another podcast media host that does the same thing. Yes, there are cheaper plans, but you can't drop down your plan to $5 a month.
I gotta say, this is a really, really great post to see, because we've talked about the benefit of Libsyn being able to do this, and here we have somebody who is actually doing it. Now, for some people, $5 a month still might be too much, but other people, you know what? Like this person here, we definitely can see that it's not too much for them, and that they're excited to be able to do that, and it's a great option, and that's one of the reasons why I do like Libsyn as a media host. There's a lot of different people out there, but Libsyn is a well-rounded media host for reasons just like this. By the way, you guys, okay, yeah, okay, you'll pay me after the show? Okay. No, I'm not being paid. I'm not being paid for this.
No, we are not paid sponsor or paid advertisers, whatever you want to call it. They're not sponsoring the show, and we get no affiliate code for sending people that way, but it is a really good host, and I have recommended them for a while. By the way, there was another comment, and I just want to talk about that. It was from QR Code Art, and QR Code Art said, you could upload your podcast to archive.org, which would be free. This is true, but you lose your RSS feed if you do that. And if you actually have a web page, a website that you have your RSS feed through, you're still going to be paying for that. There's no free website that you can use an RSS feed with.
Yeah, so really, if you're wanting to keep your podcast around, you're probably going to pay some form of money, and I think that that's the bottom line to know here. But I really like this. So simple. And then if all of a sudden they want to go ahead and fire that back up for some reason, you're still good to go. You got your feed there. You got your feed ready to go with all your media, and just pay for the higher tier. So there you go, Stargate Pioneer. Someone has proven you right again.
Again. I rarely get proven right. So yahoo! Love it. All right, Steven, that's enough of How I Save My Podcast for this week. Let's get going to the gold.
I feel like we need like some weird like intro and outro to that segment where it sounds like, oh, you're going into the How I Save My Podcast story, and it'll be like chaos. There'll be horns and traffic jams and all these other things, right? Like, you know, just a whole chaotic thing. And then on the other side, it'll be like sunshine and roses, like with the little violin. Maybe we need to do that.
Yeah. You going to play the violin for it?
Well, I'm thinking that maybe we want to go ahead and assess that change first before we implement it.
Okay. Good idea.
You see what I did there? Because today we might be talking about that very subject, because as podcasters, we can be creatures of habit. When we find a formula that works for our podcast, we tend to get comfortable. And this comfort means that we tend to keep doing what we know. But the problem is that sometimes that just doesn't work, and you may need to make changes to your show. Sometimes it's adding something, sometimes it's removing things, sometimes it's firing your co-host. These changes can happen. But here's the other problem. We've also talked a little bit about how your listeners tend to like what you've got and enjoy what you've created on the show. So this can mean that making changes to your show could possibly have a negative impact if not done correctly. And today we're going to talk about some ways that you might want to work on with implementing changes to your podcast, including reasons why you might want to do this, some ways that you can help plan and assess those changes, and things you want to watch out for, like, you know, the backlash that you'll get when you fire your co-host, that sort of thing. Stargate Pioneer, why don't you go ahead and kick us off with some reasons why you might want to make some changes?
All right. Good. So let's start off with why you might want to make these changes for your show. First, you've plateaued. Let's just pretend you've plateaued. If you've been doing the same thing with your podcast for a long time and you're not showing any growth, then it might be an indication that your audience is seeing you as stale. Or it might not be what a possible growth audience wants to see. It might be time to change things up a bit. Another reason you might need to make change is because something has become irrelevant. Perhaps you've been having a reoccurring segment on something that has your interest, but now it's not. So for example, maybe you're doing a segment on space because you're a rocket scientist, but then you find out that the Earth is really flat and you just can't be interested in it anymore because it just doesn't exist. Or let's say that the solar system has actually been invaded by a spaceship from another solar system and no one believes you. So that's just an example. Maybe you want to change up your content.
I feel like you're talking from your inner passion there, SP.
Or somebody's inner passion. Maybe not mine. So perhaps you're wanting to take your show to a new level after all this, and maybe you think that you have more to offer. Maybe everyone is still enjoying your show, but you just think that you could offer more by adding in a new segment, removing a feature, or making a change. Or, since we're hobby podcasters, maybe you're just not having any fun anymore. Perhaps you've had a section of your show where you do something, but you're just not finding it fun. As a hobbyist, let me tell you, you need to have fun because this is your fun time. This is your hobby. You're not making a lot of money about it, and the fun is the commodity that you get out of it. So, Stephen, how can you evaluate if the change is worthwhile?
You pay SP's high consultant fee and he'll tell you. I think that's the number one way, right?
Yeah, what was my consultant fee again? It was like $150 an hour, I think it was.
I thought it was like $20,000 minimum flat rate.
Minimum flat. Okay, that's good.
All right. So the first step, though, for your evaluation process, in our opinion, is to make an inventory of the ideas that you've got floating around your head. What we suggest you do is write down as many of these ideas as you have. Essentially, it's brainstorming time. It's easy for you to forget ideas, so we think it's important to write them down so this doesn't happen. Because this is really going to be the foundation for your entire evaluation process. Don't worry, just because you write it down doesn't mean you're going to use it, but it's better that you do write it down to be able to consider it than forget about it and not consider it. The bottom line is this step is all about tossing out your ideas onto a board and giving you a starting point. Essentially, you're just spitballing ideas. Now, we recommend a good place to do this is using some form of easy-to-use organizational tool such as Trello. Trello is an organizational tool that we've been using for, I don't know, a year or two now? And
it's at least a year, yeah.
Yeah, at least a year now. And whatever it is you decide to use, we do suggest that it has a few different things. SP, what do we suggest?
We suggest that your tool that you use is easy to access. You have an easy place to list your ideas. You're able to prioritize the ideas. People or yourself are able to make comments on the ideas, and that you can share that list with any applicable co-hosts, producers, maybe a select audience group, etc. Now, no, we've said this a few times in the past because we really think you need to make this step as easy as possible. You're basically just spitballing ideas. This is a brainstorming session, and you just need to get the ideas out there. In the past, when I was in training as a young engineer, young rocket scientist executive, you remember those large like paper things that you drew on, and then just paper tablets. Yeah. Those were like easy in the office. Well, you can't have that if your co-host is thousands of miles away. So you need to do it digitally, and you need to make it easy. Now, if it's too much work, you probably won't want to do this step, and you might just get stuck at the brainstorming phase and not move forward with any change, which could be good for your podcast.
So once you've listed your ideas out, we suggest that you end up listing out some more facts about said ideas, including pros. Some examples of these pros that you might consider is how this change is going to benefit your show. How's it going to benefit you? What could you possibly leverage from the change? And is there time to make this change? Is there going to be something easier that results from this change? And will it be more fun for you as a hobby podcaster? These are just some things that you want to consider when you are looking at the pros to your ideas. Some of the cons, on the other hand, is how is it negatively going to impact your show? Could it maybe come off negative towards the listener? Will it require more work? Is it going to possibly duplicate content? And if so, how are you going to handle that? if it's duplicating it within the same episode, then you're probably going to want to cut something out. But if it's sort of duplicating bad content, you got to think about, is this okay? Is the listener ready to hear that again? Is it realistically attainable? Because if it's going to require a bunch of moving parts, and maybe, for example, it requires you and your co-hosts to all be in sync throughout the entire week, and you have a couple of days every week where you're not able to do that, then it's probably not a really feasible idea for your show. That's a pretty big con as well. Is it something that your audience might possibly not be interested in? Again, a very, very large con. Now, another thing that we think when you're thinking about the pros and cons is not necessarily pros and cons themselves, but what sort of impact is it going to have on your show format? SP, what's on this list?
So if you're looking at impacts on your show, for example, how will exactly it fit into the show? This is something that is key to why you're making the change to begin with. And then also, will it offer you an avenue for new content? I mean, if you're looking to spice up your podcast at all, you got to look at, is this bringing something new into your show? Now, if you're considering removing something out of your show, will you have to replace it? Are you just going to get rid of it? Are you going to extend another segment perhaps on your show in order to compensate for it if you're trying to keep the same length on your show? And will it affect your editing flow, recording flow? For instance, if you're bringing video aspects into it and you want to edit video, that's a whole host of other issues to deal with, even if you're trying to do it the easy way. Now, if it does change the core of your show, like maybe the topic or the subject that your show is covering, are you having to revise creatives like introductions, like the intros to your show, the outros, the segment bumps, that sort of thing, album art, etc.? So if you need to make such a substantial branding change that's going to actually entail a lot of other work, you have to take that into account. Now, once you've outlined the pros and the cons, the next steps that we suggest are to wait a bit. Yep. Just sit on it. Don't do anything. Just wait a bit. Yep. The next step is just to do that. You are indeed delaying the final decision. You have made the decision. You know what you want to do, but you just wait on it. It's the same effect as you really want that next generation phone, but you know your phone is just fine. So you just sleep on it overnight. And then when you wake up, you're like, I don't want to buy a new phone for $1,500. The phone I have is just fine. It will last a little bit longer. And then you've just saved $1,500, which you can then go out and buy audio gear for your podcast.
Oh, I like what you did there. You made us think about buying audio gear.
Yeah. That's what we do on Better Podcasting, apparently, from time to time. Something new can be really exciting, but sometimes when you come back to it, you find it a little less interesting, or maybe you can find all sorts of pros and cons that you missed at the first pass, and you actually get to really evaluate the decision versus just on the surface. And it's amazing how even a few days can change your perspective on something. Like when I decided to podcast with Steven, I made that decision on the spot, and maybe I should have waited a few days.
That's a good point. And when I accepted your offer, I probably should have waited a few days so that I would realize that I'd be better off elsewhere.
Yeah. So sometimes a little procrastination can help your productivity.
So then when you think you're ready to decide on which idea you want to execute, you want to look at your list and consider the following. Which idea is going to have the best balance of benefit versus effort versus cost? Is there something you can execute right now with little impact on your show, for example? Because if it's going to take little effort and have a minimal impact on your show, maybe it's worth just doing this and giving it a try. If it's just a brief modification, and maybe not putting too much effort into evaluating the idea, because there are little tweaks that we make here and there, and sometimes it's worth just giving them a try. The other thing that you want to consider as well is what makes you the most excited out of your list. It's always good to let your passion play a part in your decision making, because you're a hobbyist and you want to be having fun doing your show. And if something is going to make you have more fun, then it might be a priority in your list because, again, you want to be having fun. The last thing you want to do is feel like you're clocking in and out of work every day for your hobby.
Now, some things to watch out for as you make the change is, are you acting on impulse? Now, it's best not to act on impulse, as sometimes just a routine change can make your audience get lost or lose connection with you. They generally want a level of consistency for podcasting. For instance, if you change where you stream every week or what time you stream every week or where you chat every week, your live audience won't necessarily have a chance to build up or catch up with you. And that's just a live audience, but it does apply to your published podcast as well. Forming your pros and cons with a bias. It's important that you try to keep a neutral mind when you're brainstorming the impact of your show. If you can, bring somebody in to evaluate your potential changes and allow them to be honest and give their feedback. This can be a podcast running buddy, which we've talked about before. It could be a podcast mentor. We've discussed that before. And by the way, you can find a podcast mentor at thepodcastmentors.com. And it could be even a focus group from your audience. It doesn't really matter as long as you're trusting the opinion of the people that are giving you a check on your decision.
Another thing you want to watch out for is you want to make sure that you don't think that the change is going to be your ultimate move. This one change is going to make everything perfect and it's going to make you lots of money, because guess what? That just doesn't exist. While benefits can definitely come from making changes with your show, you shouldn't be unrealistic with your expectations. It's important to remember that one golden ticket does not exist to podcast perfection. And ultimately, podcast perfection does not exist. So don't think that. Don't set your expectations too high, or you're going to feel like a failure when you evaluate the change. And that's the last thing that we have on this list here is you want to make sure that you don't forget to evaluate the change that you've made. Because it's really important that after you implement the change, that you take some time to evaluate and see how it's been working out on your show. What impact has it had? Now, you might go and you might set yourself a day right away. You go 4 weeks from now, I'm going to take a look. I'm going to listen back to 5 weeks ago, see how it sounded without the change, and then listen after and compare and contrast. Or it might be more informal. When you get some feedback from somebody, you go, okay, that's my cue now to go listen. Whatever it is, make sure you do spend some time evaluating the change, because you never know. When you look back on it, you might go, why the heck did I make that change? It sucks.
Or you could look back and go, wow, that was a great idea. Maybe we need to expand on it. So it's always good to go back and reevaluate. If you have a question about making a change on your podcast, maybe you've made a change on your podcast, could be as simple as just a intro change, a segment bump change. It could be more complex, like a branding change. Please let us know at betterpodcasting.com. Catch us on Twitter at betterpod, or you can always catch us on our Discord server. That's betterpodcasting.com/Discord.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
Usually here's where we do the Better Podcasting Download. This is usually the section that we've dedicated to doing that. And when we do the download, usually we try to take something that's relevant to the podcast world, something that we want to go ahead and talk about, give our opinion on and whatnot. But the reality is that there's been nothing that's happened in the last week. So it's just been empty. There's been no changes at all that I can think of.
I've been really sad all week. I've been looking at the news going, man, there's nothing to talk about. I guess we'll just have to do filler for this time and maybe go into, I don't know, maybe the streaming music industry and possible combinations with podcasting.
I get. Are we talking Sirius XM? Like I'm lost. I can't think of anything.
Well, there's the iHeartRadio.
Okay.
They purchased some podcasting, and SoundCloud. They've been doing it for a while, right?
Is Shoutcast coming back?
I haven't heard anything about Shoutcast lately. Matter of fact, I'm actually surprised you remember Shoutcast.
What's Spotify been up to?
I don't know. Let me see here. Oh, Steven, look. Spotify. Wow. Spotify bought not just one, but 2 podcast companies today. Wow.
What?
Spotify.
I think I would have heard about this.
Yeah, Spotify bought both Gimlet Media and Anchor in separate transactions.
Wow. Okay. I guess maybe we should talk about that. So, Gimlet and Anchor. Wow. That's crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah. Well, we knew that Spotify was in talks to buy Gimlet Media. We've heard that before.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden with their announcement, they say, oh, surprise, we also bought Anchor. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is interesting. It really is. So it shows that they want to get into the podcasting creation side of things with Gimlet Media, which is a very powerful podcast creation company. They are a business. They are not a hobby. They throw, 15 people at a show at a time. So you just can't compete with their production capability. And they do short runs of podcasts, right? They do seasons, basically. So Gimlet Media, it was created as a startup, and any startup has one of 2 goals. First is get bought, and second is to create yourself into a mega corporation. In this case, I think Gimlet Media just wanted to get bought eventually, and they did some amazing stuff, and they actually got purchased, and Spotify wanted to get into the podcast creation side. The other thing that they did is they bought Anchor.fm, which is less than 1 year old, by the way. The company is more than 1 year old, but like on February 20th last year or 22nd last year, they sent out an email and said, hey, congratulations, we're available as a podcast media host company. They had been a short communication company back and forth through their app and maybe a little promotion of audio short snippets, but then they created themselves into a podcast media host company. They put some creation tools behind the scene and they made it free. So everybody flocked to Anchor.fm over the past year, and it has been a hot topic over the past year. This is interesting. Steven, I want to know what your take is. What is Spotify's goal of buying Anchor.fm?
I think there's 2 things we need to consider here. There was a Medium article posted today by Anchor, and the long story short is they say that everything is going to stay the status quo. In fact, the quote is, if you're already using Anchor to make your podcast, today's news means great things for your ability to create and build your show. To be clear, the way you create, distribute, and monetize on Anchor does not change. We will continue to operate Anchor's platform as you know it, but now as part of Spotify. And in fact, it will only be getting better. So I think we need to consider that. But we also need to consider what Spotify's end goal is. They don't just go and buy this because they think that they can make some money. When you're making an acquisition like Gimlet and you've been trying to do podcasting stuff, you must have a bigger picture, in my opinion. It's not just, I can make some money maybe with Anchor. It's, we've got this picture about the podcasting, and the fact that this was announced at the same time shows that there must be something with these together. And I think that it makes sense. I've seen a lot of people, because we're recording this on Wednesday, February 6th, the day that this all came out. I've seen a lot of people on Facebook go, oh, that's weird, Anchor. Why would they boo Anchor? But I think it's important to remember that Spotify is a free service. People are shouting right now at their wherever they're listening. They're like, it's not free. Spotify is free with a paid option. It's important to remember that that's how Spotify operates. Free with a paid tier. So when you're looking at that, then something like Anchor fits into that model already. So I think that makes sense. But the other thing that I think is also really, really important to remember is that musicians over the last couple of years have been really been taking issue with streaming services such as Spotify and whatnot for not making enough money, for being basically given little money for the plays that are happening. It's been a big point of contention with musicians for the last couple of years. And I think it's important to remember that this sort of comes because when people pay for a subscription service, they pay X amount of dollars per month for unlimited listening. So obviously there's only so much money to be given when you take all of the money and give it to the other people within the organization. And so I think that there's the potential, in my opinion, that we could see an evolution change with how people possibly make money with Anchor. Because if Spotify buys Anchor, and let's hypothetically say, and this is me just speculating around things, they hypothetically go, okay, so you get ads on your Anchor podcasts, or you pay this X dollar a month, you Spotify Plus subscription or something, and you get all the podcasts on Anchor without commercials, kind of like how they do with their music. Then what happens to those plays that are through that? Are they going to be less? I don't know, right? We could look at the YouTube model as a bit of an example on what that might shape up to be. Keeping in mind, YouTube is a very, very, very big organization, being under the Google banner, and things are a little different under Google than they are elsewhere. So I think it's really important to remember that the pay-for-play / subscription model with music isn't exactly playing out well for artists, at least as well as they would like it to be. And don't we think we might be a little naive to think that that might be different with podcasting? So I don't know. That's just my take on it. I think it's worth considering, and that Spotify probably has a big goal. Now, I did just quote what they put on Medium, but we can look at the many, many different companies that Facebook's bought over the years, and high-profile names who created said companies left because they didn't like what Facebook was doing and realized that this could potentially happen here too. Once you're under the Spotify banner, unless you've got something in that contract that says for X amount of years or whatever, it can change. Just because Spotify says this is what they're going to do now doesn't mean it won't change. So I think that it's worth considering that. That's my all take on it. And I'm very interested to see where this goes and what Spotify's plan is, because I really think Spotify must have a plan.
I wonder, and I don't know if they know what they bought. I don't know if they have a clear indication of the pros and the cons of Anchor. For instance, Anchor is not IAB podcast measurement guidelines compliant, and I have not heard any indication that they want to be certified either. So that is a drawback that they'll have to develop. Could it be done within their existing architectures? Yeah, but they have to actually go ahead and do it. And by all accounts, the actual certification process takes a long time. So they have to explore things like that as they go forward. The other thing that I'm worried about is they're a streaming service, so they very well understand bandwidth, but I don't know if they understand the bandwidth of the RSS feeds themselves. Like, they might be looking at the MP3 files going, okay, so the average podcast gets how many downloads? How big are the MP3 files? You know, our servers can handle this bandwidth. And unfortunately, the RSS feed gets hit an awful lot. When you take a look at media host companies for podcasting, it's not necessarily the bandwidth of the MP3 files that are going back and forth. It is the RSS feeds that are just even being hit for a, hey, have you updated yet? Or somebody going in and wanting a particular episode through their podcatcher, and that's all done via the RSS feeds. So I think Spotify might be in for a small rude awakening into all of this, and we'll see if they eventually need to monetize the podcasts that are on Anchor by just a pay to play sort of thing, like any other paid podcast media host, whether that's $5 a month or whether it's $20 a month or whatever it is. I think within 6 to 18 months, they will start charging. I think also the people on Anchor might need to take a hard look at the terms of service that they're under and determine if Spotify, as the new owner of Anchor, can actually go in and own the content that's on there. Say you've done a show and it's been pod faded for several months, like 6 months. The service is only a year old, so it can't be a show that's been dormant for years. So what happens to that show when the people don't care about it anymore? Maybe it's a good comedy show that the comedian's like, yeah, but then drops off and just the show's sitting there. Who owns the rights to the monetization after the show's been sitting vacant for X amount of time? You don't know. So if I'm on Anchor right now, first of all, I would never be on Anchor, at least under their previous business model. I would not be on Anchor today because it's uncertain. If you're on Anchor today, I would be very uncertain about what the future is, and I would be looking at different opportunities to actually bring my podcast to the next level, make my podcast better or better podcasting. That's what this show is all about. We've always recommended either self-hosting, go to Better Podcasting episode 65 to know more about that, or go to a podcast media host that we would recommend, which would be Libsyn or Podbean, if you're really uncertain about your future of your show on Anchor.
Yeah, it's definitely an uncertain time, but I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with it. And I have to say that I am a little shocked at both of these just because of the fact that I feel like Spotify never really got their first step right. Like, I felt like it's still sitting there half created. Like, the whole Spotify podcast integration, I've never felt like they locked that up and that they got that all ready to go 100%. So I definitely think that this is interesting to see that they're jumping in already. But again, I'm sure that they have a vision. And in any case, I will say this, that the purchase of these two companies with such large transactions, it's so good. It's so good for what podcasting means to the world because of the fact that it shows that someone like Spotify, who's been music, is going into podcasting in an even bigger level. And how cool is that for podcasting? I think that that's cool.
It is cool. And I hope it doesn't give a false impression on other companies out there to create a podcast media company, whether that's a production company or a media host company, and just think that you're going to get bought out. These two companies work really hard at doing what they do or advertise what they do and providing a great service. I think Anchor would have probably have gone bankrupt or had to close their doors or actually charge for service within not that long of time frame, like 6 or 12 months from now. I think they were burning through cash pretty hard. Could they have gotten investments? Yeah, but obviously now it's Spotify's issue. So we'll see what Spotify has to do with it. Until then, I don't recommend going on anchor.fm because of all the issues that I listed before, but I will be watching to see what Spotify does with them.
Before we hop off of this here, since you just said it, I know there's a couple people that use it in the podcasting world. The .fm, really, for podcasting? Really? Let's go ahead and move on to the Better Pod back. There is actually an elite comment club that you don't know about if you have not checked out our live shows, because we stream this live on Wednesdays at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. Well, most Wednesdays. And what happens is there's a live YouTube raw video posted to our GonnaGeek channel at youtube.com/GonnaGeek. And throughout the week, eventually that gets pulled down when I start to feel like it. Usually it's either when I'm editing or 3 weeks later when I've realized I've left the video up. And what happens is when I pull down that video, it also removes any of the comments that were made on the live video. Thus, your comment fades away, but you know it was there. We know it was there, and you're part of that elite club. And we actually had a member join that elite club this past week, right?
We did, but first, before I read this comment, I just want to say, Stephen, you know you can bring those comments back by temporarily publishing the episode and then bring it back to private. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read this comment right now. It's from Wild Roots 3. Wild Roots 3 said, "Wow, cool. I just watched this live recording. It's the first time I've seen one from your show, and you made a nice shout out. Thank you. By the way, and no offense at all, but my name is pronounced Soraya. Thank you again, and you guys are awesome." So thank you very much for Soraya for your actual initial feedback and this comment on YouTube. We really appreciate it.
Moving on to Discord, we'll highlight a few things that came out of our Discord this past week, including we had Damien the DM talk a little bit about his 5-person setup that he had going on, that he has to record his podcast. And there's a whole bunch of back and forth, but he did share a picture of what he has when he records his podcast. and it was really cool to see. It was great. There's people behind the mics. It was neat to say. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was he said, we use TV trays instead of a single table for that specific reason, in reference to noise reduction and things like that. So if you want to check out the rest of that, that's www.betterpodcasting.com/Discord, DISCORD.
It's that Canadian spelling.
Yeah, exactly. We also had Zachary Webb, by the way. What did he have to say?
Oh, he saw Damien and he said,
really
a pod.
We should probably just put that on the soundboard. Then it'll be in sync every time.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It gets slower every time, so you'd have to slow it down and screw with the pitch and stuff like that. Anyway, thank you very much, Zachary, for knowing our little quirks about talking about other podcasts on the network.
We had an interesting one come from the Liberty Dude. What did the Liberty Dude have to say?
The Liberty Dude said, just out of curiosity, on your website, it appears you have a box, quote, current live stream show, unquote. From what I have seen, this stream box contains chat box and a YouTube video link. And if this is the case, why are you not just using the YouTube Live chat feature? Well, Stephen, why are we not using YouTube Live chat?
Because it's YouTube Live chat, and that means that we're restricting our users to having to log in through Google. When we talked a couple weeks back about chat rooms, this is why we don't specifically want to use that, because it means that every single person that wants to chat with us has to have their Google account that they feel comfortable posting as. And some people want to log in Facebook. Some people want to be a guest. Some people want to just come into our chat and say, hey, get out of my chat. It's just a whole bunch of different people that want to post in different ways. And so we like to make it so that whatever chat we're using has the most versatile login options, or at least there is a main login option and the option to be a guest. And so the YouTube chat, we just feel like it's a little bit too restrictive. Plus, honestly, it's not that great.
I've used the YouTube chat for lots of sailing YouTube channels that do live chats and other shows that use it too. And quite frankly, I'm unimpressed, especially when they do the super chat where you can actually donate along you. So all you hear is these cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Like, oh my gosh, I just want a nice experience talking or listening to the people that are sailing and get their opinions on what's going on. So yeah, I'm not a fan of the YouTube chat. Now, moving on, Jonathan Bloom on the Discord said, and I heavily recommend RX Isotope. It's used in all my productions, and Elements is a great way to get in. And this is in regards to the sale that was going on with Isotope Elements.
Over on Twitter, we had that one interesting podcast say, can y'all make an episode about how to switch hosting sites? I know there's a lot of information about it on the internet, but it's a bit confusing to people. Well, we have some ideas on something that we might do with this topic in the future. We're not going to do it immediately, but I do want to address this right now because I think it's a very, very good question. And if you're actually sitting there like, I need to switch right now. I can't wait for them to talk about this in the future. I got to go now. Our number one recommendation is to email the person you're switching to and ask for help. Because if you have chosen a reputable company, they will help you with that. And if they don't help you with that, then you probably should think about going with a different type of company because they probably will not support you very well in other manners. If they're not going to help you getting over to their service, how are they going to be when you're sitting there paying for the service? So that's what we would suggest. And like, I know Libsyn does a really, really good job of this. You email them, you say, hey, I'm with so-and-so, I want to switch. They will help you to get over to Libsyn. So I think that would be the place that we would say start if you have that question.
Yeah, just in brief, those considerations for your RSS feed, make sure you have that redirect put in if possible. And also, if you want your past episodes available in the future, you need to transfer them to your new podcast host somehow. This could be as simple as you downloading them if you don't already have them available on your computer, which we recommend that you should. or it could be an actual transfer and your new podcast host could do that. So those are just two big things to keep into consideration. But yes, Stephen is absolutely right. Actually contact the media host you are switching to. They will help you.
And lastly, what do we have from Cybercast?
Cybercast said, "Hey guys, I found your last episode a little confusing when talking about all the ways to go live and interact with listeners. You didn't recommend a good way to go. You just listed all the different ways. What is the easiest, best one to do for a live show? Thanks."
SP, I'll let you start it off here.
This is great because it's the standard answer. It depends. It really it depends on how you want to interact with your audience. So that is actually why we didn't list a recommended way to go. We use our own webpage. We stream through, in this case, YouTube, but we're connecting via Skype. And then we have a chat room, which right now we're in the middle of exploring different options of what we want to do in the future. So what we have there is temporary, but it's all just on our live page. So at first, I would say, make sure you get a live page ready to go. Now, if you don't have a live page, say you're with Libsyn or Podbean and you just have one of their web pages and you don't have the ability to have a web page, I think I've seen different people post their links to their YouTube channel. And then when they go live, the people know that they need to go to your YouTube channel and they can subscribe there, but then you're carrying multiple different platforms. So it's just easiest if you have your own website, if you go to a live page like we do, and that people just know at this time, at this place, they're going to be live no matter what platform they're using. I think that's the simplest way to do it. If you're just wanting the easy way to go live, Spreaker and YouTube. If you want audio only, Spreaker. There's also Mixler, but they're both paid. Or there is YouTube. So those are my recommendations, but the .live is definitely the prime one if you can do it.
Yeah, and don't feel you have to do video. Feel free to do audio only. There's a lot of people who do check out audio only broadcasts. And I think it just depends on whether you want to actually interact with them. If you're just wanting to stream, then look at something as simple as using Hangouts on air and don't worry about the chat aspect.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or enable the chat on YouTube.
Yeah.
Like we just said, it's not our preferred thing, but hey, it'll work. So it's really what's easiest to you and what's more applicable to your audience. Like I know a lot of people use Twitch too. I mean, you're not locked in to YouTube. You can be on other platforms as well. YouTube is just more ubiquitous to a broader audience. A lot of the older audience like me, that have platinum in their beard, might not know how to get into Twitch or be on Twitch or whatever, but I will watch sailboat YouTube videos, so I know what YouTube is.
I do want to say this as well, that as far as the way that certain people prioritize things as well, that can change what ends up being, quote, the easiest way to go. And what I mean by that is, like, I will say that I personally judge people who use Hangouts on air that are professional services. I think that people who they've got a lot of listeners and viewers, and they're primarily focused around their live stream. The people who are doing these live shows, and that's mostly how they operate, and they're just using Hangouts on air rather than actually putting a little bit of time into some better production. I personally judge those high-end shows that are doing that because I think that that's a lazy way to go. So for someone like myself who's doing that, Hangouts on air isn't going to be an option for me because I personally will think that that isn't the best way to go. So that sort of is just an example on how somebody's priorities could change what's easy. So when I am looking at myself and I'm not wanting to use Hangouts on air, easy becomes more difficult. So again, back to what SP said, it depends. So there you go. I'm sure we made a confusing idea even more confusing, and that's what we're here to do on Better Podcasting.
I will reach out to Cybercast and say, if you give us an indication of your criteria that you're looking at, we can give you a plus minus, a pros or cons. We can be your podcast mentors and select a different way to go, or whichever way that we would go with your considerations.
So if you have something that we haven't talked about in regards to that, please get in touch with us through any of the ways. We would absolutely love to be able to share that. You can go ahead and go to betterpodcasting.com, email podcast@betterpodcasting.com, tweet us at betterpod, head to facebook.com/betterpodcasting, or best yet, and I'll say that right now, best yet, go to www.betterpodcasting.com/Discord, and please chat with us over there.
Yeah, a lot of fun conversation there every day. We can't be on it all the time, of course, but when we're available, we like to pop on and say hi and really get involved in the chats back and forth. Could be anything from podcasting to smart tech to gaming to TV stuff. So it's all part of the GonnaGeek network, and we love to talk to people over there.
And before we do close here and say our goodbye messages, again, I mentioned this, we do chat at www.Geeks.Live when we record this live. And in the chat, we do have one user that is just asking us stuff that I think the timing, just with sort of the way that there's a slight delay, it's just hilarious how much we're just slightly off from each other. Anyways, I want to specify one thing here. I am not saying don't use Google Hangouts. I'm saying I personally judge the higher end productions that use Google Hangouts. I think Google Hangouts has a very, very good place, and there's many people who are very smart to use Google Hangouts, even with some of the problems like lower resolution, lower frame rate, questionable audio at times. I think that there's a really good use for that. And so, especially for hobbyists. So I'm not saying don't use it. Okay. So I just want to clarify that right now before people think that I'm saying don't use Google Hangouts, because I think that there's been a lot of success, including from my partner in crime.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to talk to you off air. Starling Tribune and Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. use Google Hangouts on air to broadcast, and we've been doing it for quite a few years, and it's worked for us, so it can work for other people. But you're right. If you're going to a higher quality show and you're just using Google Hangouts, I get what you're saying, because if you're talking like a Geek and Sundry or something like that, you would expect a higher level quality of connection.
There we go. I'm glad we clarified that before everybody sent us hate mail. Now they can save it and send us some other sort of hate mail. I'm sure it's coming.
Send your hate mail to Steven@GonnaGeek.com.
But there you go. For episode number 167 of Better Podcasting, I'm Steven Jondrew saying thanks for checking out the show. Appreciate you coming on by the Discord server too.
And I'm SP saying skin cancer clear and the beard's going on. See you guys next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a GonnaGeek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.